it's Sherry's a hard act to follow, and I'm not even going to try to talk about the things that she talked about. I totally agree with that. All of the above strategies absolutely essential. I want to talk a little bit about the other end, because a lot of what Sherry talked about was sort of what might be thought of as sort of the front end of the economy in terms of addressing carbon emissions, and then how do you get carbon out of the air? And so dealing with energy systems, transportation systems, those kinds of things. All of those are absolutely essential. They're absolutely essential. One thing that I would just add to that is that there's also a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of what could be thought of as the tail end or the back end of these, which are the communities that are already being affected by climate change, right? Yes, so here's where concepts like mitigation, adaptation, and restoration come in. So mitigation is how do you mitigate those impacts that are already there? Communities that are affected by sea level rise, communities that are affected by drought, communities that are affected by various other impacts. I mean, those are sort of two of the biggest ones. Climate change, the way that climate change manifests in most cases has something to do with water, right? Temperatures also, but a lot of it is drought, either too little water or too much water. So flooding or drought or sea level rise are different aspects of this kind of same problem, different manifestations. So one of the questions is, how do you mitigate those damages that are already being done? Another aspect which is related is adaptation. How do you help communities adapt to changing environments, right? So this is slightly different from mitigation, but it has to do with how do you deal with adapting to changing conditions, less water, more variable rainfall, right? In South America and the places that I work, one of the things that people talk about is that the changed seasonality of rain. So in the Altiplano in Bolivia, which is this big high plain at about 4,000 meters, so it's maybe 12,500 feet, just this big flat plain up in the Andes. It's a pretty extreme environment already, and one of the things that's been really difficult for farmers is the changed seasonality. It's difficult for them to know exactly when the rains are going to come, and that impacts when they can plant. So if they plant too early or they plant too late, they might lose a harvest, right? So that kind of changed seasonality is a big impact for them. There's actually, rainfall has actually stayed pretty constant. So it's not that there's less water in the system, but the water is coming at different times and it's coming in different ways. And so, a lot of it will be in these big torrential rainfalls, and then you don't get anything for another 2 months. And so, adaptation would mean how do you capture that water? So the water that does fall in torrents, it doesn't just simply run off or evaporate, but you actually capture it in a way that can be used. So providing more water for communities that need more water at times when they need it, in addition to adaptive agricultural strategies and other economic alternatives for people to make a living without having to leave their communities and move to cities or move overseas and migrate. Thanks, Ethan. I think those are things that we should think about as well. And then the final one that I would say is restoration. And by that, I largely mean ecological restoration. So areas that have been deforested, areas where environments have been transformed, we need to do a lot of work in terms of restoring wetlands and restoring forests, because those are really good sinks for carbon. So carbon sequestration is another part of that. So I would say those three things: policies that affect those specific actions in specific places. And these are more or less local policies, local or municipal based. They're not, you can have global strategies, but where the rubber hits the road is going to be in local communities and municipalities. So mitigation, adaptation, restoration, I think are all three really important concepts.
Can I just add one thing to that to try to wrap it together, which is one of the things you hear a lot in the public debate in the US, but also internationally, is this whole idea of the Green New Deal. which is an attempt to try to bring together what Thomas mentioned, which is how do you solve these problems while assuring that local communities and disadvantaged communities are not excluded from the outcomes, but rather are repaired in the process. And so the New York State legislation, which is focused on climate leadership, is attempting to build this connection. The Green New Deal idea is also one. If you look at the Biden administration's set of priorities, they kind of play out in a Green New Deal scenario, and without using the word sustainability.
Yeah, I guess to link what Tom and Sherry were saying, Tom was talking about restoration, and you mentioned that that restoring wetlands and forests, have afforestation projects that are driven locally, but if they're extensive enough, they can draw out a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere, which is what Sherry was talking about, needing to drive down the CO2 concentrations, bring CO2 out of the atmosphere. And there are, a ray of light is that if we restore forests to at a fraction of what they once were in areas that have been deforested at this point, we can cut down. It represents the amount of CO2 that would be drawn down through photosynthesis by those forests is close to 40% of what we emit annually. So it would take a big chunk out of that CO2 emissions, annual CO2 emissions. So, okay, that's all I had.
Thank you guys. That was really informative. So I think this is going to be the last prepared question that we get to, but it's about climate literacy, and it's stressed by the Restore Our Earth initiative. So I think it's important that we talk about it real quick before the Q&A. And it's, what is climate literacy and why is it important?
Well, maybe I'll just start by saying, I don't know the term climate literacy. Climate literacy as related to understanding the science behind climate change is how I'm interpreting that. And I think that I think that climate denial is not a function of people not being scientifically literate or climate literate. Their surveys have shown that folks that don't believe in global warming or that humans are involved in global warming, they are even slightly more convinced of their knowledge, that they have better knowledge than folks that believe that the climate is changing, the globe is warming, and people have something to do with that. So if we want to, and I'm looking in, I guess maybe I'm reading into might be reading into this question a little bit more than I should, Madeline, but if we want to change people's minds, there's a big divide between Democrats and Republicans, and in terms of Democrats, by far most Democrats believe that the globe is warming and it's due to humans, and most Republicans do not. If we want to make those changes, change some minds, we can't just throw facts at them. We can't try and educate them, because they'll resist. People will resist that. We're challenging their belief systems in some ways, and so there are strategies that we can go about doing that. Having fellow Republicans who are trusted, who believe in climate change, address these people. A lot of churches will, a lot of religious groups are as a group, they're Christians, white Christians are evangelical Christians are as a group, they're climate deniers, and we need folks in the church who will, people who these people trust, talk to them and try and convince them otherwise.
Okay. Oh, am I muted? No, I'm not. Sorry. All right. So I don't. Do either of you have anything to add, or? Okay. So with that, we will transition into the Q&A portion of our evening. So if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand. We already have a question in the chat, so I'm going to read that out right now. So the question is, news reports keep emphasizing that China is the number one greenhouse gas emitter, but that's a snapshot, while the USA is the number one all-time emitter. How do we keep from China bashing in conversations on climate change?
So China is the number one emitter, but the emissions per capita is not the highest. So going back to what Doug said about and Tom about consumption patterns, in the United States, our per capita emissions are a lot higher. Not even though our total emissions aren't higher. I think that the issue about China is that China is actually making a really serious effort to try to shift to deal with its expanded population, its interest in economic growth, and doing it in a sustainable way, and trying to make the shifts towards a low carbon economy, but at the same time is making investments that are good for its economy, that unfortunately are fueling coal-fired plants and the building of coal-fired plants in other places. So people are concerned about that. I'm not sure I would call it China bashing. I mean, the commitment from China to dealing with the problem has clearly been very front and center and at the table. And so I think in a serious way. I mean, it's, I think, when from the standpoint of shifting from what during the 1990s China was considered and still is a developing country, which were the developing countries were kind of off the table in terms of the climate negotiated framework, that the countries that were responsible for the problems, those developed countries, were the ones that had to come up with the solutions and address some pretty aggressive targets. The Chinese were off that table, and to China's credit, in the 2015 Paris Agreement, worked together with the United States and other countries to join the team talking about, we're in this together, in the sense that we've got the largest number of emissions. We're willing to work together to try to shift this big ship around, and that's an important piece. I think there's going to be some holding back in the near term. We've got till November for the next big targets to come out. I mean, there were a lot released today, but the fact that China didn't have a big number today that's different from before, I think it's not hugely worrisome. There's plenty of time to work together and negotiate up until November.
Yeah, I agree with Sherry. China is really concerned about global warming. They've got a lot of people living along the coast, including Shanghai, the world's largest, most populated city. So they're leading the US in solar cell development. And if you travel through China, I've had the opportunity to do that a couple of times. You find solar panels way out in the middle of nowhere. Small huts by very poor families living in them will have solar panels on their huts. So there's they're taking this very seriously. You know, they're also, they're still building coal-fire plants, although not at a rate they used to. So, you know, so in terms of China bashing, I don't know. We'll have to see how things negotiate, as Sherry was saying.